The silence in space stations always felt manufactured to Thomas. Not like the real silence of empty rooms or forests before dawn, but rather the aggressive hush of recycled air and sound-dampening panels working overtime to mask the mechanical breathing of a habitat that shouldn't exist. He'd been on Meridian Arc for 3 weeks, and the artificial quiet still made his skin crawl. Absolutely under no circumstances are you to approach Princess Lyrie, Ambassador Chen had told him that morning, her face severe on his comm screen. Don't look at her, don't breathe near her. The Valrian take their royal protocols seriously, and we cannot afford an incident. Thomas had nodded along, adding this to the growing list of things he wasn't supposed to do. Don't sample the Krillian fermented beverages. Don't mention the Sigma Accords around the Tethran delegates. Don't ask why the ventilation system smelled vaguely of cinnamon on odd-numbered decks. His job as a cultural liaison was less about building bridges and more about not accidentally burning them down. The mandatory reception in the observation garden was exactly as tedious as he'd anticipated. Various species clustered in their diplomatic circles, exchanging pleasantries that meant nothing and promises that meant less. Thomas had shaken hands, pseudopods, and one thing that might have been a sensory appendage, smiled until his face hurt, and finally escaped to the garden's perimeter where the crowds thinned. He found a bench carved from some dark stone, positioned to overlook the massive transparent dome and the Helix Nebula beyond. The nebula turned slowly in shades of copper and violet. A cosmic storm froze in mid-swirl. Thomas sat down with a sigh that nobody heard, grateful for even 5 minutes away from conversations where every word required 3 layers of diplomatic interpretation. At least the view doesn't require small talk, he muttered to himself, a habit from too many years working alone in archives and translation booths. Fabric whispered against stone. Thomas's entire body went rigid as someone sat down beside him, close enough that he could see the elegant drape of deep blue ceremonial robes in his peripheral vision. He didn't need to turn his head to know who it was. The sudden silence from the reception behind them, the kind of silence that comes from 200 beings simultaneously stopping their conversations, told him everything. Princess Lyrie of the Valrian Empire sat approximately 2 feet to his left, her posture impossibly perfect, her hands folded in her lap. Her ears, long and tapered like a sculptor's idealized vision of elegance, caught the nebula's light and seemed to glow faintly at their tips. She stared straight ahead at the cosmic display, her profile serene and untouchable. Thomas's mind raced through his training. Was standing up an insult? Was staying seated presumptuous? Should he leave? Should he speak? Every option felt like a diplomatic landmine. His comm device began buzzing frantically in his pocket, no doubt Ambassador Chen having a small stroke somewhere in the crowd. So he did the only thing that made sense, absolutely nothing. He sat there, barely breathing, watching the nebula and trying to pretend that his career wasn't potentially ending in real time. Minutes passed. The princess didn't move, didn't speak, didn't acknowledge him in any way. Thomas's initial panic slowly gave way to a strange curiosity. She'd chosen this bench specifically. The garden had dozens of seating areas, many of them empty, yet she'd sat beside him. Why? Well, he whispered, more to himself than to her, this is either the best or worst thing that's ever happened to me. Statistically, probably worst. He didn't expect a reaction and didn't receive one. But something shifted, the tiniest change in her breathing, perhaps, or the almost imperceptible relaxation of her shoulders. She remained silent, but it felt less like indifference and more like peace. They sat together for 20 minutes while Thomas's comm device vibrated itself nearly off the bench. The nebula continued its ancient rotation. Somewhere behind them, the diplomatic reception had devolved into confused whispers. And Princess Lyrie, untouchable and unreachable by reputation, simply existed in the same space as a confused human translator who had no idea what was happening. When she finally stood, The movement was fluid and unhurried. She didn't look at him, didn't speak, but she paused, just for a heartbeat, before gliding back toward her entourage of attendants who looked equally bewildered. Thomas watched her go, noticed how the crowd parted like water, and realized he just experienced something he couldn't begin to explain. His comm device immediately exploded with an incoming call. Ambassador Chen's face appeared, purple with either rage or panic. "What did you do?" she demanded. Thomas looked at the empty space beside him, then back at the screen. "I sat on a bench for 20 minutes with the Valrian princess. Do you have any idea?" "Ambassador," Thomas interrupted gently, "I genuinely have no idea what just happened." That at least was the absolute truth. The botanical archive smelled like earth, which was probably why Thomas had volunteered for the assignment. Somewhere between the diplomatic catastrophe of sitting near Princess Lyrie and now, he'd been quietly reassigned to the most obscure corner of Meridian Ark's research division. His new job involved cataloging Terran plant specimens for the station's xenobotany database, which meant spending his days alone with ferns and mosses, while the real diplomats did actual diplomacy. He didn't mind. The solitude felt honest after weeks of forced socialization. Thomas was labeling his 40th sample of the day, some variety of earth ivy that had probably cost more to transport than his annual salary, when he heard the door whisper open behind him. He didn't turn around, assuming it was one of the researchers coming to check on the environmental controls. Then he heard the subtle rustle of expensive fabric and felt his stomach drop. Princess Lyrie sat down in the chair across from his workstation. Not beside him this time, but directly in his line of sight, her hands folded in that same serene pose, her expression utterly neutral. She looked at him with eyes the color of storm clouds and said absolutely nothing. Thomas's hands froze over the specimen tray. "You've got to be kidding me." She didn't respond, didn't even blink. "Okay," he said slowly, setting down his labeling stylus. "I'm going to assume you're not here to learn about earth plants. I'm also going to assume that me panicking and running away would be rude." He paused. "Are you allowed to nod? Is nodding a thing in Valrian culture? Or is that considered legally binding communication?" The princess remained motionless, but something flickered in her eyes. Amusement, maybe, or pity for the rambling human. Thomas took a deep breath. "Right, well, I've already been demoted to moss duty, so I guess there's nowhere to go but up." He picked up a sample of Terran clover. "This is Trifolium repens, commonly called white clover. Humans used to consider it a weed until we realized it was fixing nitrogen in the soil. We're good at not appreciating things until they're gone." He continued working, narrating his process because the silence felt less heavy when filled with his voice. He told her about Earth's meadows, about how humans had nearly destroyed their own biosphere before figuring out that maybe keeping the planet habitable was a good idea. He described the smell of grass after rain, the way certain flowers only bloomed at night, the inexplicable human fondness for growing plants in small pots despite having perfectly good ground outside. Lyrie listened with absolute attention. She didn't interrupt, didn't check a device, didn't show any sign of boredom. She simply was there. This became their pattern. Every third day, around the same time, Princess Lyrie would appear in the botanical archives. She never announced herself, never explained, never spoke. Thomas would continue his work and talk to fill the space, sometimes about plants, sometimes about human history, often about the small absurdities of existence that nobody else seemed to notice. "Your people must think I'm corrupting you," Thomas said during her 5th visit, carefully transplanting a seedling. "Or maybe that you're studying me. Are you? Is this some kind of anthropological research? Observations on the human tendency to ramble when nervous?" Lyrie's eyes tracked the movement of his hands as he worked the soil. "The thing is," Thomas continued, his tone softer, "I've been reading about Valrian culture. I probably should have done that before coming here, but hindsight and all that." He set down the seedling and looked at her directly. Your words carry legal weight, don't they? Every statement is considered official, binding, potentially precedent-setting. You're not choosing silence. You're trapped in it. For the first time, Lyrie's gaze lifted from his hands to meet his eyes. The storm cloud gray held something profound, recognition maybe, relief at being understood. That's why you sit with me, Thomas said quietly. I don't need you to say anything. I don't want anything from you except. He gestured vaguely at the space between them, this, whatever this is. The princess didn't confirm or deny. She didn't need to. Thomas saw the answer in the way her shoulders relaxed, in the almost imperceptible nod that might have been acknowledgement or might have been nothing at all. They sat together for another hour in comfortable silence, surrounded by the green growing things of Earth, and Thomas thought that maybe he'd finally done something right on the station. Thomas's transport back to Earth was scheduled for 800 station time. He'd spent the morning packing his few belongings, saying abbreviated goodbyes to the handful of researchers who'd bothered learning his name, and trying not to think about the fact that he'd probably never see Princess Lyrie again. Their strange friendship, if that's what it was, had continued for 6 weeks. She would appear in the botanical archives, he would work and talk, and they would exist together in a bubble of silence that felt more honest than any diplomatic negotiation. He'd learned to read her subtle responses, the slight tilt of her head when something interested her, the way her ears would angle forward when he said something particularly absurd, the rare, fleeting smile that never quite reached her lips but lived in her eyes. He'd never asked why him, never demanded explanations. Maybe that's why it worked. On his last evening, Thomas returned to the observation garden where they'd first met. The nebula outside had rotated to a new angle, its copper tones deeper now, more crimson. He sat on their bench and watched the cosmic storm, memorizing details he knew would fade with time. Footsteps approached, light, measured, familiar. Thomas's heart kicked against his ribs. Princess Lyrie sat down beside him, and for the first time she was completely alone. No attendants hovering at a respectful distance, no guards stationed at the garden's entrance, no court observers tracking her movements. Just her, in simple robes rather than ceremonial dress, her long ears catching the nebula's red light. "You're going to get in trouble for this," Thomas said softly. She didn't respond, but her presence felt different tonight. Less serene, more present, solid, real in a way that their previous encounters hadn't been. They sat in their familiar silence, but the weight of unspoken things pressed down like gravity. Thomas thought about all the conversations they'd never had, all the questions he'd never asked. His transport left in 12 hours. If he didn't speak now, he never would. "I don't know why you chose me," he said, staring at the nebula. "I'm nobody, just a translator who got demoted to plant duty. There are 100 more important people on this station, people who actually matter." He paused, gathering courage. "But these past weeks, sitting with you in the archives, just being quiet together, it's been the most meaningful part of my entire assignment, maybe my entire career. And I wish," his voice caught, "I wish I understood why." The silence stretched long enough that Thomas thought she might not respond at all, that this would end the way it began. Wordless and mysterious, he started to stand, to give her an escape from his emotional confession. "You didn't want anything from me." Thomas froze. The voice was barely above a whisper, soft and melodic with an accent that bent vowels in unexpected ways. He turned slowly to look at her. Princess Lyrie's eyes met his, and they held oceans of loneliness. "Everyone approaches me as a political tool, a symbol, a means to treaties or trade agreements or social elevation." Her fingers tightened in her lap, the first uncertain gesture he'd ever seen from her. "You sat on a bench and wished the view didn't require small talk. You didn't see me at all." "I saw you," Thomas said quietly. "I just didn't see a princess." "Exactly." The word carried weight, relief, something close to grief. "Do you know how many beings I've met in my life who weren't calculating my usefulness? Who didn't measure every interaction against potential gain?" Thomas shook his head. "One," she whispered, "you." She stood, and Thomas thought the moment was ending, that she'd walk away and he'd carry this conversation back to Earth like a secret. Instead, she reached into her robe and withdrew something small, a crystal, multifaceted and glowing with internal light. She placed it in his palm, her fingers brushing his for just a second. In Valrian tradition, she said, her voice still barely audible, this signifies personal regard, not political alliance, not diplomatic courtesy, simply regard. Thomas stared at the crystal, feeling its warmth against his skin. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. You never did. She turned and walked away, her pace measured and graceful, disappearing into the station's corridors without looking back. Thomas stood alone in the garden, the crystal warm in his hand, watching the nebula turn its endless spiral. He'd come to Meridian Arc as nobody important, had been warned to avoid the untouchable princess, and had somehow stumbled into a connection that defied every protocol and expectation. He didn't know what it meant for the future. If it meant